Hi and welcome to Shakey's podcast. Thanks as ever for joining. Please do like, subscribe, comment, get involved in the discussion. Lots of great guests coming your way. Today's guest, fantastic guest lined up for you today. A super talented Irish writer, a best-selling author with Democracy for Sale. If you haven't read it, read it. Also got a newsletter about it, which I've recently subscribed to. Lots of amazing stuff to read in that. As well as that, broadcaster and investigative journalist. So highly talented man and guest today. I say hello to Peter Gagan. How are you, sir?
Hello, how are you? Good to have you. Good to be with you guys. I am very, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure, sir. Pleasure. Now let's just start at the top. We have a bit of a mutual thing here. Well before my time, I've been player coach now for a few years at a cricket club in sunny Edinburgh at Inch Park called Edinburgh South Cricket Club. And well before my time, an Irishman graced the turf. But I believe not a cricket bone in your body, but you did it for so long. A talented writer. What made you stay at the club for so long?
The club, no, so not a cricket bone in my body. Never played before, actually. The first and only time I ever played cricket was for Edinburgh South. I ended up captaining the fourth team, we were a motley crew, but it was great fun altogether. I really enjoyed it. And I think why I stay so long, I think probably why you probably stayed at the club, incredible people. It's really one of those places. I still have great friends from my days at Edinburgh South. I think cricket is a fascinating game. I always enjoyed watching cricket when I was younger. And there's something about that mix of tactics and strategy, I think, that are part of cricket, but also the fact that things can happen that are unpredictable and not surprised about that. So in some ways, it might be a metaphor for life.
Listen, brilliant. How many seasons did you play?
About 3 years, I'd say. I lived in Edinburgh for 4 years. So I was there about 3 years and then I moved to Glasgow. So I had to give it up when I moved to Glasgow, and now I'm in London, so I don't really get a chance to
Well, next time you're in Edinburgh, please do pop in. Please do pop in and visit.
I would. I'd love to see it. I have, as I said, I have incredibly fond memories.
Peter, tell me just a quick snippet about your childhood, your family background, and ultimately why you chose journalism.
Well, I'm from a place called Longford, right in the middle of Ireland, quite a small town in the middle. It's kind of rural Ireland. You'd say it's a kind of it's a rural area. I'm from quite an unremarkable small town. I went to my local primary school, local secondary school, all that sort of thing. Run by the church, because that was the way it was in Ireland back in the day, run by the Catholic Church. And I fell into journalism, actually. Really, people ask me, like, hey, how did you do what you do now? And sometimes I go, I don't really know. I actually ended up, the reason I was in Edinburgh was because I was doing a PhD. I did a PhD in human geography at the University of Edinburgh. And when I was finishing that, I got a job in Belfast for a few months working on what's called a postdoc. So when you're finishing up your PhD, you might get a job like this. It's a research job. And I used to freelance for a local arts magazine. And I went out for a pint with the editor one evening, and his main reporter had just left. And I was actually going to do a job interview in London a couple of days later, and he goes, don't suppose you fancy working here? And that was it. That was the job. The wages were unbelievably bad, even for Northern Ireland. But that's how I started. And in many ways, I kind of haven't left since.
First question is, you covered conflict in the Balkan Wars. And for my listeners and for people on the outside, anyone who tunes into this, what was that experience like, and what did you learn there?
Well, I didn't cover the conflict itself. I covered the year. I would spend a lot of time in the Balkans, like I did in Northern Ireland. I ended up living in Northern Ireland for a few years. I ended up spending a lot of time covering what you might call post-conflict society. So the Balkan Wars happened from 1992 to 1995, which I watched. I remember they were very seminal for me growing up watching them on TV. They were huge. In some ways, the first TV wars in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed. They were shocking. And then in Northern Ireland, which is a place very close. I'm from very close to Northern Ireland. We also, a much more low-intensity war that went on for 30 years, and 3,500 people lost their lives. And I was very interested in these sorts of society, like what happens after conflict. How or is it possible for societies to heal after conflict, or what happens to these countries and these states? And the Balkans is in some ways a really fascinating example of that. You have, it was one state, Yugoslavia, broken up into these republics. There was the wars, basically, for those who don't, who weren't following. Yugoslavia was ruled by Tito, who was the kind of communist ruler, the communist dictator from up until he died in 1980. And after he died, Yugoslavia had it always had competing tensions between different ethnic groups, a bit like Northern Ireland, where you've got tensions between Catholic nationalists and loyalist Protestants. In the Balkans, you had that, but way more, basically. You had Croats, you had Slovenes, you had Serbs, you had Bosnians, and there was a huge amount of tensions, and they were all living within this one state. And in the kind of late 90s, this state started to break apart. And that's really where the wars came from. There's a series of wars, first in Croatia, and then most violently in Bosnia itself. And Bosnia itself is still divided, really. It's divided into a Serb-run part of Bosnia called Republika Srpska and a Muslim and Croat-run federation, and it's still a very dysfunctional place and still has huge problems. And I spent a lot of time actually there, I spent a lot of time in Kosovo as well, which was formerly part of Yugoslavia and is now. There was a war, people might remember, that was more recently in the late 90s. And again, it's these states that are trying to kind of come out of that kind of conflict. I always really enjoyed reporting and trying to understand, it's kind of almost like you have war reporters and they go and report on what's happening now. And I'm kind of trying to report on what's the long-term effect of that many years later. So I found it very rewarding work, actually.
What do you think we learned? What do you think we learned during that conflict, and how would you compare the learnings from that to are some of the same mistakes being made in some current world affairs as well?
Yeah, I think if you think back to when a lot of these things happened was in the 1990s, and there was a sense of, I think, of hope and optimism as well. Okay, the Balkan Wars came out of the disintegration of Yugoslavia, but there was also a sense of which I think there was international efforts to try and build peace and to try and make things happen. And I think you see a lot less of that now. There's a lot of these accommodations, is what they were. There were accommodations in states to try and accommodate multiple minorities, really. These are states in which you have, rather than one big majority, you've got minorities, some of whom had much more power than others. And these were attempts, at least, and they didn't, successful and unsuccessful, to try and accommodate, I think, difference, to try and accommodate the fact that you have multiple people with different aspirations, different ambitions, who want different things, all living in the same place. And I think we've moved away from that. There isn't that kind of international, the kind of strong international presence, the strong international, like to the UN, that would have been quite influential and very important in driving both peace in Northern Ireland and forcing some resolution into the Balkans. Kind of disappeared. And we've ended up with a series of strong states and weak institutions. And if you look at, wherever, it's not hard to look around the world now and see, see that examples of that, where there isn't really a strong institutions that are able to force majority states to not kill large numbers of people. And we're seeing that in Gaza, Lebanon, and Ukraine, and in many places all around the world.
Just another question that comes to my mind there. International Criminal Court has, issued an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, but some of these Western leaders are basically saying that it means nothing. That's a concern.
Yeah, definitely. So the ICC did a lot of investigations into there was the ICTY, the International Court for the former Yugoslavia, and they brought a lot of people to justice, and there's still cases going on. So this is from the wars 30 years ago. So you have, on the one hand, a kind of sense in which this court is rightly, I think, trying to bring people to justice for crimes that were committed quite a long time ago at this stage. And it's still a big live political issue in lots of Balkan states. People are constantly being arrested. Senior politicians end up in The Hague. Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic, lots of big people end up there, and most probably Slobodan Milosevic as well, the kind of Yugoslav leader who really kind of lit the fuse for all of the war that came. And at the same time now, I agree. I think you've got, the United States doesn't recognize the ICC. And I think that's exactly it. It's there's a much stronger sense of unilateralism, a much stronger sense that and I think it sends out an incredibly bad message as well. If you've got, it feels like one rule for large, powerful states and another rule for small states.
Yeah, it's concerning. You've done a bit of traveling around Eastern Europe, I believe. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the investigations you covered there and what you learned?
Yeah, I've done quite a lot of. Most of the investigative work I've done actually outside of the UK has been in the Balkans, looking a lot at things like environmental damage and environmental corruption, because these are big issues. I do a lot of work on the environment in general, and what you've got is, again, people are able to take advantage of weak states, which is often the case. So you've got recently I did a story about a company called ArcelorMittal, which is basically the world's biggest steel manufacturer. I've done a number of stories about them actually, and they have a big plant in a place called Zenica in Bosnia, which is just on the doorstep of Europe. And it was about like environmental regulations and failures. And I've been to that town, and it's appalling. You've got like black smoke belching out all over this town. The situation is really bad, and promises that were made 20 years ago when the factory was bought just haven't been done. And the company would say we haven't done it because we're in the process of doing it. It's expensive, it takes time, etc., etc. But it's hard to avoid the sense that these things, it's very handy to have cheap factories on the outskirts of Europe, where you're not subject to the same laws as the European Union, but it's very easy to export into the European Union, and where labor is cheaper, etc. And so I've often looked at that, how large corporations and multinational companies are able or take advantage of lax regulations, often weak government, often regulatory frameworks that just don't really work at all, lack of oversight to operate in these countries that are like not that far away from us geographically, but often quite far away from us in our mind.
Do you think the European project is failing, Peter?
I think it's definitely in quite a difficult position. It's in a much more difficult. I think failings are kind of, if you think about the history of Europe, which is a history of war. What Europe has been, there's been wars throughout European history constantly, and so from 1945 on to now, there was the war in the Balkans on Europe's doorstep, and we've now got the war in Ukraine. But there hasn't been a war in the rest of Europe, and what traditionally were the places where there's a lot of wars in Europe, shall we say. And so I think in that respect, it's been hugely successful. I think we can kind of understate how successful it is in doing that, in providing a forum for people to feel European, which I think people didn't for a long time. That wasn't something that people felt. So I think it's done quite a lot in that respect. I think it's struggling now at the moment. I think it has a lot of challenges. Part of the challenge is that it struggles to articulate what's the European Union for. I think part of the reason we ended up with the Brexit vote here in the UK was, what is the European Union? What's it for? So I think there's a real tension between, I think, and at the heart of it is such a tension between France and Germany, and France and Germany's competing interests and what they want, which is partly why the European Union was set up in the first place. And I think that's a really big issue. And the way in which I think it has not done well when it comes to the Eastern expansion, and even the way it treats the Balkans as well. These expansions took place 20 years ago. There was very little attempt actually to try and bring up living standards in the countries that became part of the European Union. Similarly, the Balkans have been promised European Union membership for 20 years, and we're now talking about 2050. And so I think a lot of the practicalities of the European Union project are really, it's under threat and it's under challenge. And in some ways, like its success and its failure, you can see from the rise of far-right politicians in Europe. And what's fascinating about them is they don't actually want to leave the European Union, because for a bunch of reasons, mainly financial. But they also see that the European Union is a really effective bad guy. And I think that tells a lot about both the successes and the failures of the European project.
You touched on Brexit there. What are your thoughts on, when Brexit happened? It's been a couple of years now in the UK. I mean, you've got the likes of Italy. They're interested out here in leaving. What is your general thoughts on Brexit in general?
Well, it's interesting. I think Brexit put off all those other countries from actually leaving. So if you look at most of the perspectives for what you call Eurosceptic parties, they've changed quite a bit. So the National Front in France, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, they're talking a lot less about actually leaving the European Union, but they're talking a lot more about wanting to repatriate powers, and that's what I mean. It's become quite a useful stalking horse. So in some ways, Brexit served as a cautionary tale, I think, for a lot of Europeans, that like actually going ahead and leaving the European Union is a complete pain in the bum and isn't helpful. It doesn't really get you very far. Like British GDP has been significantly down. Private sector investment in Britain's been down since 2016. It's never really recovered. It's one of the reasons our productivity is so bad. So like in terms of indicators, economically, Brexit's been a failure, but politically, politically the jury's out in some respects on whether Brexit succeeded or failed. Brexit has changed the political conversation in Britain massively. And so in that respect, I think there's definitely people for whom would see Brexit as a success. as an economic project, but it was never really an economic project. It never made any sense economically. It never stacked up. And the problem, the Brexit referendum was able to pass and to go through because those tensions were never really brought to the fore, I think. And it was what Brexit looked like had yet to be decided. But in whatever shape it took, it was always going to be economically damaging. But where we are now with it, I think if you look at, like, say, where Nigel Farage is in our politics, the way we talk about migration, like a lot of things that we talk about are kind of products of the Brexit referendum, are kind of corollaries of the Brexit referendum. So I think it's even though on its own terms as an economic project, it has been a pretty miserable failure. As a political project, I think it's still there, and it's not hard to see a kind of radical right in Britain, a populist right, the Farage right, becoming even more powerful.
Do you think the politics of a lot of the countries that we've talked about represent the people?
I think that what's been really striking is this growing sense of disconnect between what you might call like technocratic liberal governments, or liberal governments of the centre left and the centre right, and ordinary voters. You can see this. I think you can see this in the opinion surveys, which have been going on especially over the last 15 years. You can see a lot of the level of unhappiness with politics, I think, is so striking. And it's much bigger than it has been for a very long time in many respects. In many of these countries, the biggest in recorded history. I just saw just a few days ago, before we were speaking, in Romania, they've elected the guy who's come into the runoff for president is kind of seems to be yet another pro-Russian populist, in a country that doesn't really have a huge history of electing pro-Russian populists. So this is happening across the piece. And I think the kind of politicians that, the kind of slightly dull, boring, technocratic politicians who've really kind of run politics for a long time, they have no real answer to this at the moment. I don't know what for them the answer is, but I think there's a real challenge because the sense in which, and there's been such a disconnect as well. I think the power of people, the power of mass movements has just declined so much. The power of unions has declined. So the kind of checks and balances that used to exist in kind of post 1945 democracies in the West that kind of represented people's interests, represented workers, etc., they've really disappeared. So what you've got is large numbers of people who don't really have a hell of a lot of representation. And governments pay lip service to them, but I think really struggle. And in some ways as well, have a tendency, it's really striking watching the Labour Party in government in Britain, have a tendency to kind of keep repeating the same things that they're not able to deliver. So a government gets elected, it says we're going to change X, Y, and Z. They're incapable of doing it for a bunch of reasons, some of which are pretty structural, some of which aren't. And all that happens is people lose trust and faith in politics more and more and more. And I'm not surprised massively that when someone turns up like a Donald Trump or a Nigel Farage figure that offers quite easy solutions to complicated questions, that people lap it up.
You have written the bestseller I mentioned at the top, Democracy for Sale. I guess my question to you is, why do you say democracy is for sale in the UK?
What I'm talking about in a specific way there is it's a really good question. And I mean it in the sense that I think what we have in the UK is a system in which people with money and people with vested interest get privilege, and in many extents really, really extraordinary privileged access to our political process. I think that goes back to this question of, are people represented? Do politicians represent people? I think every politician will say, I do. I have a surgery, and I meet loads of politicians who are really good. But I think we have a huge problem in that we have the way our political system is set up, and we're not alone in this, but we've got some quirks and unusual things that are just for Britain, means that people with money, people with power, people with influence have an oversized ability to influence politics and to make it work for them in ways that they want it to work. Probably the best example, which is in it's at the back of my book, because after the book came out, I reported a lot on it, so I kind of did a new edition with more information in it. It was about the COVID-19 and COVID contracts. I'm sure listeners remember that. There was an issue I reported on a lot, and we had see major politically connected figures getting these huge contracts. If you were a political donor to Conservative Party, you were 10 times more likely to be given a COVID contract than somebody else. You were put in what was called a VIP lane for COVID contracts. And I think a lot of people go, what? That's crazy. And I think we've had this system in Britain for a long time, and we have it across. You can see it in America, you can see it in other countries too, where very rich individuals, rich companies, and politically connected people are able to influence the political process in ways that ordinary people have no chance to, no ability to. And the common thread there is money. It's money that buys you access to power, access to politics. So in Britain, our politics runs on private money. It's all it's individual donations rich people give to political parties. And if you want to get an example of people, you might argue people give to parties because they believe in them. But if you look at this, the general election this year, Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party raised about £4 million. In the previous general election, Boris Johnson raised about £60 million, like 12 times more money. 5 years earlier, after 5 years, a lot of inflation too. So like £4 million worth even less in comparison. Why was that? Simple reason. Rishi Sunak was going to lose, and people don't want to back a loser. It was exact way in the opposite direction for the Labour Party. The Labour Party took in millions and millions, tens of millions of pounds ahead of this general election, and almost no money in 2019 because people thought they were going to lose. Why do people give money like that? Because they expect to be able to influence politics. And we have loads of examples. My work is a lot looking at things like the lobbying industry, the influence industry, how lobbyists and how vested interests are able to influence the political process, do get privileged access to politicians, and are able to influence politicians to make decisions in their interests. And I think that's what I mean by a democracy that's for sale. Votes are not for sale. It's not like, I do not believe that you go to a voting booth and someone pays you money and you vote. That was what it used to be like 150 years ago. But instead, what we do have is a political system in which money buys you access.
You touched on something there that I was going to ask you, and I think you've already confirmed along the lines of the answer. Do Western governments have a serious issue with lobbyists? There seems to be quite a lot of influence behind the scenes with the likes of America, United Kingdom, Germany. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, well, if you look at the COP conference that was on recently in Azerbaijan, the big climate conference, I think there was about 6,000 industry lobbyists there, oil industry lobbyists. So that's a huge number of people. And in the same way that like a lot of former politicians go into the lobbying industry, or former ministers. Similarly, like my profession, journalists, there's a lot less journalists than there were 10 years ago. A lot less. I'd say probably a third of as many journalists there was 10 years ago. A lot of people go into lobbying jobs, or public relations jobs, PR jobs. In the UK, we've got really lax rules on lobbying. Transparency International reckons only about 4% of lobbying is captured by the rules that we have. So the rules we have are really, really poor. They tell us almost nothing about what's happening. So that's why I think the work that me and others do is important, is because we're trying to keep track of that. And the only way I can do that is by talking to sources, by sending in freedom of information requests, by pushing for the release of information. But often there isn't a lot, and that's a huge problem. So we don't know who's influencing our politicians as well. And I think across the piece, the power of the lobbying industry has become much more pronounced in the same way as the power of organised labour has declined. I think the power of the lobbying industry has become much more advanced, and you see that. You can see like when a politician leaves office and they end up getting a job, on the board of a lobbying company or in that space. It's very okay. You can kind of see what's going on here, and I think it's an issue across the piece, and we know that voters care about it. I think it's the kind of thing that feeds into that question you asked earlier about politicians not representing voters. I think most politicians want to; they think they are, but they don't. I often feel politicians don't even realise how influenced they are by the people that are around them.
We had recently some horrendous UK riots. My question to you, Peter, is the UK inherently racist or not? And do the media and the politicians fuel some of this?
It's a very good question. I think if you look at what we saw on the streets, I think the anatomy of those riots, which I think we're still trying to fully understand, spoke a lot about how fragile British society is right now. You had this horrendous act of horrendous series of killings essentially on the streets by a lone wolf attacker. You then had a lot of disinformation and misinformation going on social media, particularly on Elon Musk's X. You had all these people on the street. You had the police, which seems incapable of dealing with a lot of these issues increasingly too. We know that from reports about policing. And you have a populist politician in the shape of Nigel Farage, who's now in Parliament, which frankly we didn't have before, that is inflaming these things. And I think this is the real danger for Britain at the moment. We do have a lot of these moving parts that are there and can be activated between a political system that has, populists who will try and make political capital out of things like this, out of in some ways pandering to racism or being overtly racist themselves. You have an information ecosystem that has completely changed in 20 years and feeds a hell of a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and you have like decades of underfunding in public services that both feeds into people's sense of grievance. People go, there must be some reason things don't work as well. It must be because someone else is using the service as opposed to it's just run down. And it also means that in the immediate moment, services struggle to actually deal with something like the riots. And I think if you take all those things together, I think it makes for quite a toxic environment. And at the same time as well, we've had a hell of a lot of frankly racist kind of tropes from government in the UK over the last 5+ years, especially since the Brexit referendum. And I think that will also feed into it too. You had a Home Secretary in Suella Braverman who used words like invasion to describe people coming to the UK, and I think that also feeds into, and we know this from academic work. Like once prominent, acceptable politicians or accepted politicians give kind of support to these sort of views, they become much more mainstreamed. It's often spoken about Enoch Powell's "Rivers of Blood" speech, his famous speech, who was a Conservative minister, his famous anti-immigration speech in the late 60s. What's striking about Enoch Powell's speech is that was the end of his career in the Conservative Party. He never served as a minister again. He was basically kicked out of the Conservative Party effectively, and he ended up in Northern Ireland as an Ulster Unionist MP for South Down. That is not what happened with Suella Braverman. Suella Braverman was, in many ways, her speech, her inflammatory rhetoric actually made her more popular with sections of the Tory right. And it wouldn't be hugely surprising if she ended up back as Tory leader or someone from her camp does.
How do we fix democracy in the UK, Peter, so it benefits the people?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. Shaky. How do we do it? There's things that most things I talk about and I recommend are I would admit are quite technocratic, fixy things about the role of money in politics. There's loads of ways we could take money out of politics. There's lots of things we could do that would effectively just give us just take money out of politics. There's loads of things we could do. There's loads of laws we could bring in. It's possible to give unlimited amounts of money to political parties, which is crazy. You can give as much money as you want. That's totally mad. There's lots of things we could do to address that. There's loads of ways we could change lobbying industry. We could make it much harder for lobbyists to have all this access to politicians. We could make it much more transparent. There's all of these things that we could do. And I think these things would help. I don't think they're a magic bullet. I don't think they would solve everything. But I think there's quite a few things. I was at a launch of a group in Parliament this week, which was the Fair Elections Group, and they brought out a new report, and they'd like 3 areas they were concerned about. One is electoral reform, one is my big issue, dark money in politics, and the other was disinformation. Disinformation is very hard to do anything about, just as Britain. You can see Elon Musk's Twitter. It's very hard for a country the size of Britain. It's not really that big. It's not really that powerful. That is a real threat to democracy around the world. I think the level of at which our information ecosystem is polluted is a real problem. But outside of that, there is things we could do. There is reform. There is things that we could change. And I think fundamentally as well, I feel like there needs to be a shift, even like in I think too many politicians, and I think this is where populists are really right and are able to exploit this. Too many politicians of the non-populist politicians are stuck in a very old way of talking, and an old way of doing things, and an old way of talking about things. And they say things that people don't believe. And they don't believe because they're not going to happen. Like when Rachel Reeves says the other day, we're not going to raise taxes again. She's going to have to raise taxes. It's just not going to happen. It's just reality. When we talk about like how to get people back to work, and so we're going to make welfare pay less, it's like, well, we've been doing that for 30 years, and it's not. Welfare payments in the UK are now at their lowest for 40 years in terms of job seekers allowance. It's the lowest per index rate, so it's very low. Can't go much lower really, and people, or otherwise people would literally starve on job seekers. Okay, so it hasn't worked. What else might work? And I think like there's a kind of level of honesty that's kind of missing. And I can see it with this Labour Party too. I think there's a tendency to treat the public as if they're a bit dim. And I think that really feeds into populists, because they all turn around and go, these guys, you can't trust them for X, Y, and Z reason. I'm telling you the truth. And they mightn't be telling you the truth, but the first bit is probably a correct analysis.
Let's move into the United States, somewhere that you know quite a lot about. You spent a lot of time over there.
Yeah.
Peter, some say investigative journalism is dying in a world where social media is taking over significantly. You were out in the US, I believe it would be about 8 years ago now, when Trump was elected the first time. Now, you covered that and you predicted, I think, in advance of his victory, that he was going to win. What did you investigate and what did you find out there?
Well, I wasn't really doing any investigate. I was reporting, really. I was kind of I was being a reporter on the ground, so writing about what was happening, what I was seeing. I was going to events, talking to people. It was a fascinating trip. I went across the Midwest of America ahead of 2016, where Hillary Clinton was widely expected to win. Donald Trump wasn't given much of a hope at all. And I couldn't help but notice a lot of people were going to vote for him, and I kind of was like, I think he might win. And so that was really interesting. I think I saw a lot of the things. I'd also covered a Brexit referendum in the UK, so I could see some of those parallels. You could see how he was tapping into a kind of sense of massive disenchantment, disaffection with huge aspects of democracy, and I think that was a real thing. You could really see it on the ground, and in some ways I wasn't surprised when he won. In some ways it's shocking but not surprising.
From on the ground, any examples of some of the feedback that you were getting?
You would meet people like. It was it was kind of a mix of things. On the one level, you had people just a kind of sense of anger with the political class, which is some of the stuff we've been talking about. People would also tell you things that were just crazy, like Hillary Clinton eats babies and is running a paedophile ring, and that was a big thing. Lots of people believed that stuff. People had seen stuff on the internet and they believed it, and you could already start to see the start of a kind of information bifurcation where different people live in different information camps. So there was all of that too. But also fundamentally, you could see how people did not like the candidate the Democrats had put up for election. So all of those things, I think this is the problem at the moment, I think, for non-populist parties is they always pick one of these things. They kind of say, oh, this is the thing, or this is the thing, or one of these things. It's like our candidate wasn't good, or our policy wasn't good, or it's the internet, or it's the vote. It's a constellation of factors, and you could actually really see that on the ground. You could see a lot of people who were like, just, they were dissatisfied with policy they'd seen it. They really did not like the candidate. I think the Democrats had a huge opportunity to win that election. Obama had been a popular president. They had incumbency. They could have won that election, but they did the same thing this year. The Democratic Party kind of the machine decided to basically rig the process, and people see that and people don't like it. So I think it's all of those things put together.
You were back out in the US again, because I know you were, because I was trying to get hold of you and you're a busy man, but you were reporting again on the US election. Obviously this time round it was a battle between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Donald Trump convicted of lots of things in advance of this election, sexual assault, etc. And he won again. What does that mean for the United States and the rest of the world, Peter?
What does it mean? Well, he did. I think it's a huge. We don't really know. I think it's a short. If I was on your podcast now telling you I knew exactly what it meant, I think it would. I wouldn't be being true. It's huge. I think there's a much bigger election result in 2016. In 2016, you can argue people did not know what they were voting for. Lots of people I've met in like somewhere like Ohio were voting for change. Were looking for for something different, for something to change. Whereas this time around, I think it's a much more I think it's a different. We're in a different world, frankly. Trump in 2016 came in with not a strong idea of it wasn't really clear what his agenda was. It felt as if there wasn't really anybody around him, so he felt very chaotic. This time around, Trump has been pretty clear about what he wants to do. He wants to rack up tariffs. He wants to deport tens of millions of people. He wants to take over the key kind of institutions of key institutions of the state, and he wants to put his people there. Who if you look at the pick so far, it seems that loyalty to him is going to be the number one thing. So I think it's a huge change, and I think it can't be underestimated. I don't think any of us know what it looks like, and I think it's really hard to tell. But you have got someone who's been elected to office promising to do really, really radical things. Like, I don't know how you deporting tens of millions of people no country has done that in peacetime in living memory. This is a huge thing. So that I think it's going to be, and he's the support he has from people like Elon Musk and now from industry as well. I think it's not hard to see a lot of American industry lining up behind Trump as well, because they realize that it's quite a transactional thing for Donald Trump. It is about, if you give me loyalty, I will reward you, and if you don't, I will, hell mend you. So no, I think it's hard to underestimate just how big it is. And what I felt watching the results come in was imagine what it's like to be in Ukraine at the moment, because I think that will definitely there's a reason why Ukraine was so worried about Trump winning. I think it's going to change the face of geopolitics hugely.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the things that Donald Trump boasts about is the fact that he never started any wars, and he claims that he's going to stop all the wars. Do you think that will be the case?
No, I think what I think is really funny about it is he never started. Like, almost all the wars we're seeing are products of Donald Trump's time in office. I think that's the bit. That's like, Donald Trump was in office for 4 years. It doesn't mean that when he ends, the influence of a political decision isn't just the minute it's taken. If you look at Putin was massively emboldened by Trump's time in office. NATO was weakened by Trump's time in office. And what's the kind of the guarantor of Ukrainian sovereignty was basically America and NATO, and America's role in the world, and America being a big presence in the world. That was massively weakened over Trump's 4 years, and the NATO alliance was. So that's the context within which Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine, and he also does it. It's worth remembering as well. There was a year of COVID, so there's quite a lot there. Even if you wanted to, you probably weren't going to be invading anywhere. Similarly, the war in Israel, that Trump gave the green light to a huge right-wing push in Israeli politics. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem, really giving the green light to Netanyahu in a very, very stark way about annexation of the West Bank or about settlements. The atrocity of October 7th was in some ways a kind of a violent response to what had been an increasing sense in which any sense of Palestinian statehood was being completely destroyed. And that really did come from Trump. It was continued quite a lot by the Biden administration. A lot of what Biden did was continued. But that is the nature of American politics too. Often, one administration will continue the other. But the whole rapprochement between Israel and the Middle East states like Saudi Arabia, which was on the brink of recognizing the state of Israel before October 7th, that all came from Trump's time in office. And so I think I think that's where where I can see Trump being very successful. Like, things that go wrong, I think it'll be quite easy for him to pawn off onto something else. He's quite good at doing that. And I think this is the same way. The answer I've given you is quite long-winded and complicated, whereas there was no wars when I was in office is quite simple and straightforward, and people go, okay, fair enough.
No, thank you for the clarity on that, because I'm just a normal guy who follows what I see on social media, etc. And that is an agenda that he pushes, that he never done a lot of these things. So it's interesting to hear a bit more on how it all works. As we come to the back end of this podcast, I just want to touch on journalism in general. Your craft. As a seasoned journalist with a long distinguished career, what's your take on the current climate of journalism?
It's in a really tough place. It's in a really difficult place, journalism. I now run my own Substack, Democracy for Sale. We do a lot of publications with other partners. It's reader funded mainly. Most of the funding comes from readers giving us, supporting us, which is really great. I set up the Ferret in Scotland as well, which is a similar reader funded, and some philanthropic funding as well, which is the same as my model. And that's been good. And I think there's been a good opportunity for like small outlets like ours and really focus on doing investigative work and bringing out new stories. But in the main, I think it's in a really difficult position. You've got the internet has changed not just how people consume news, not just changed politics, it's changed journalism. It's changed the business of journalism. When was the last time you bought a newspaper?
Yeah, I can't
Not
remember.
probably not for a while. So yeah, the media landscape has massively changed, and also the expectations on what media can do have changed, because people can see on social media in real time things happening. They're like, why isn't this being reported? And it's like you have less people doing more work than ever before. I've worked in jobs. Thankfully, I don't anymore. Where I'd have to produce 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stories a day when I started my career. So this is really almost impossible. It's really hard to do, and this is the climate in which a lot of journalism is happening. And at the same time, we haven't really found ways to, like, traditionally journalism was run by big media barons, and it made lots of money. One of the reasons these media barons brought into journalism, because it made a lot of money. It made them money. These things were profitable. That's no longer the case. So news outlets are no longer. They don't make huge amounts of money, if they make any money at all. And so what you've got is increasingly you've got owned by large companies who just want to make shareholder returns. They keep cutting, and I think it's in quite a difficult. It's in a scary place, I think, for a lot of people. And similarly, the rise of AI is going to make it much easier to create bullshit content, effectively content that comes AI generated, riddled with errors probably, but will go straight onto the internet and will travel quite quickly. So I think the media industry, there's good work, and I see really good colleagues, and I worked in for-profit media, and I now work in not-for-profit media. I see lots of good work in the space I'm in. We spend a lot of time, take a lot of care in the work we do. We're very rigorous, but it's hard, that's one small area. I'm very aware that the work we do and the work my colleagues do is good and is often recognized as such, but the wider ecosystem's in a really difficult place.
Do you think there's a big part of this is trust? And the people, what trust people have in the mainstream media? I don't know if you've seen recently, but even the likes of GB News are now doing more views than the likes of BBC and Sky. People are going to influencers for their news. Has that got something to do with trust? Is that an all-time low with the media?
I think trust is part of it, for sure. Trust is an issue, trust in journalism. I think as well, but you're not going to get much on GB News and from influencers that is actually very rigorous and is well reported. And that is a big problem too. So you've got, I think it's trust, but also there's an element where people do want to hear things that reinforce how they view the world. And all these outlets will tell you things that reinforce what you think. People want to, I think as humans, we like to be told that we're right. So if you've got certain viewpoints, maybe GB News will tell you you're right. If you've got other viewpoints, someone else will tell you you're right. The BBC is much more like going to tell you on the one hand this, on the one hand that. And that is the BBC style of reporting. I criticize the BBC a lot. We probably all criticize it for different things. We probably all have different views on why we think it could be better at this, that, and the other. But there's definitely a value in having some sort of space that's telling you broadly, these are different things. And I think that's the kind of closing of that is quite, I would say, not as a positive, really. I think it's good that other people are getting out, putting new information into public domain. But like, if I look at somewhere like GB News, I don't think GB News has ever broken a single story. I don't think it's capable of doing any reporting of any quality whatsoever. It's never shown, it's never put any money into it. It's only capable of giving views. And anybody, frankly, can give a view. It's not hard to sit and come up with a kind of controversial view on something. And what happens then is you end up with an ecosystem where people monetize controversial views. So you can sit there, you don't really have to do any work to do that. And so you can sit there and come up with more and more controversial views that reinforce certain worldviews that people like, and they will continue to consume your content. But I think that's quite a vicious circle, really. And I think I think is also quite damaging.
Have you ever been kind of, with a newspaper editor, forced to write something or told not to write something?
No, this is the thing. I think how newspapers work are kind of like, it's always a lot more subtle, like how the media industry works. I've been told not to write about stuff they're going to get because of fear of being sued. That's the biggest thing, frankly, because it's a great expense. And I haven't worked. There's lots of newsrooms I haven't worked in. So my experience, some people might, I'm sure, and some people will say, look, I know what the editor's going to like, and they're not going to like that, so I won't pitch it. That's for sure. That's definitely a thing. But I've never had anything like that where someone said, no, well, we can't write about that person. I've definitely had stuff where it's like, we can't really write about that because we get sued, or like that person's very litigious. And I don't, that's one of the reasons I like running my own thing, because I don't think just because someone likes to send legal threats, I shouldn't be able to publish information to the public domain. But in fairness to the editors who are doing that, news organizations now are very, very risk adverse. The bosses of news organizations don't want to get into legal battles. They don't want to spend any money. They don't want to have to claim on their insurance. They want an easy life. And I think that's one of the biggest problems as well when it comes to media.
So as an independent, have you had many legal threats? Many threats?
It's a kind of constant. I've had over the course of my career, I've had many, and mainly more as an independent than I have working for mainstream outlets. Yes, I've been sued a few times. Never ended up in court. Never had to admit any liability. Never paid anybody.
How do you ensure what you're reporting is fair and balanced? I'm really interested to know that.
Well, this is what I mean about how it's very easy for somebody to sit and come up with opinions on things. And what I do is most of what I do is reporting. So I go and find documents and facts and talk to people. That's how I do it, is find information and try and put it together in as fair and balanced a way as I can. Like news, there's no such thing as, there probably in some ways isn't such a thing as an objective truth. We all have different positions. And the people you call on to talk about a story, will tell a different version of a story. The people you ask to comment on the story, do you ask the trade unions or do you ask a right-wing think tank? Depending on what they say and who you ask, different views. And there's only so many words to tell a story in. So that's with that kind of like proviso. But at the same time, I do a lot of work using freedom of information. I do a lot of work with documents. And what I'm trying to do is put together things that are rigorous, and at the end of the day, you can say, yep, that is factual information. That sentence is correct. That sentence is correct. That sentence is correct. That fact, these are factual statements. And I think that's really important. I think it's important for people. I very rarely use anonymous sources. If I do, I don't tell a story that's just from an anonymous source. You'll often see that where anonymous sources said X, Y, or Z. I don't do reporting like that. I don't think that's huge public interest in that. But I think that's why I think there's such a value in reporting, and why I think it's so important. I think we do need facts and pieces of information. And yes, those facts and pieces of information are marshaled to tell stories in certain directions, because that is the nature of anything. You cannot write, the word is there, story. So the way you put facts together is because you believe this is an accurate, or as accurate possible description of the world. But I still believe that, a kind of fact-based journalism is that's where I come at it, rather than endless controversial views.
What does the future hold, Peter? What are you? What's on the horizon? What are you looking to investigate or report on in the near future?
There's a lot of work. There's lots of work. With Democracy Side, we've got a lot of different stories. We're doing a lot of work on some of the themes we discussed, looking at issues of lobbyists access to government, who funds our politics, political power, who funds politics, who's giving money to politics, who's getting influence, looking at things like I do a lot of stuff looking at environmental crime as well, corruption. So a lot of those sort of stories: crime, corruption, politics, influence, dark money, all of those things are the kind of things you'll find at Democracy for Sale.
I will look forward to following it closely, sir. And I just want to say to you that it's thank you very much for your time today. I know you're a very busy man, and I really appreciate you giving me an hour here today to talk through some of this.
Thank you very much, Jake. I've really enjoyed it.